This is a Squiz podcast. We're your shortcut to being informed.
Safe to say there are more than a few issues being debated in the US presidential election campaign. So in part 2 of our Shortcut series, we're taking a look at domestic matters like the current state of the economy. There's the frequent flyer issue of abortion rights that's front and centre this time around. We'll also get you across gun law reform, the country's response to climate change, and what the candidates plan to do about all of these things if they're elected. Squiz Shortcuts is the backstory to the big news stories. I'm Kate Watson.
And I'm Claire Kimball.
Claire, last week's US election shortcut was all about how US elections actually work. So how candidates get elected, the states to watch. That's sort of my favourite part, I think. It's the most helpful, that kind of stuff. So if you missed that one, it is worth a listen just to get the setup. This week, domestic policy. I, for one, am very glad we're spending time on this because sometimes it's hard to get to the substance of the election.
Yeah, and look, there's a reason why we talk about it as a presidential election. It's about two people and the personalities are very much front and centre of the discussion. From this distance, it's very easy to think that that's all it's about. But of course, for many voters in the United States, they're very, very concerned about the policies. And when it comes to policies this time around, let's start at the top. So according to the Pew Research Centre, which is a really highly respected non-partisan think tank, it's based in Washington, D.C., it found that 8 in 10 registered voters say that the economy will be very important to their vote when it comes to voting in this presidential election.
Not dissimilar to here. This is a big issue everywhere around the world at the moment. Americans are struggling with cost of living pressures. High inflation, it's the same old story, has seen costs rise, everything from food to petrol to electricity. When you look at those everyday things, there's been a 20% rise in prices since 2021.
Yeah, and naturally that's weighed very heavily on business and consumer sentiment, which when you then put it into an election context, it's very much on their minds about who they're going to vote for. So at the start of this year, there was a lot of talk about America potentially going into a recession. But in recent weeks, that talk has turned very quickly around to America landing what they call a soft landing.
And explain what that is.
So what it is, these are conversations that you'll be familiar with because we have been talking about it a lot when it comes to the Australian economy. They've had high interest rates for quite some time. Pretty much when they were putting up interest rates, we were doing exactly the same. That was to take pressure off inflation. And when you look at the United States, that's absolutely worked. Last week, they reported inflation of 2.4%. It's their lowest inflation rate in more than 3 years. And ahead of that, the Federal Reserve, which is like our Reserve Bank, they actually cut interest rates. It was a really big global economic story. Their jobs market is still very strong as well. So now jobs are being created, activity is happening in the economy. It looks like they've tackled inflation and done it without destroying their economy more broadly.
So you might think, just in listening to you talking about this, you might think that would play well for Kamala Harris.
You would, because she's been part of the Biden administration and they've handled all of that. However, when you look at it, Americans are really hurting. So they're not thinking about the progress that's been made and, oh, good, inflation's down. They're thinking about exactly what's happening with their budgets and the troubles that they're still having in paying their bills, paying for petrol and paying for food. So when it comes to Kamala Harris, she's not getting a lot of plaudits for all of that work that's been done.
So the economy's kind of going well, but day to day, family to family, the effects of they're still really hurting. So, and what that shows is that Americans are actually still trusting the Republican Party more on the economy and trusting Donald Trump more on the economy than Kamala Harris.
It's a bit of a familiar conversation that we also have here in Australia. There's this sort of natural tendency to think that the Conservatives here in Australia, the Liberal Party, the National Party, the Coalition, are better at managing the economy, whereas the Labor Party are better on things like social policy. It's like that with the Democrats and the Republicans in the United States as well. So the polls still show that Americans trust Republicans and Donald Trump to manage the economy better than Kamala Harris or Joe Biden can.
Bingo, you said the word policy. Let's talk about policy, how they're campaigning on economic policy. Both are really trying to convince voters that they're the right person to improve things. Harris has focused very much on easing the financial pinch on everyday things like groceries, housing, the cost of raising families in particular. One policy that I feel has had a lot of airtime, I've seen this a lot, is her proposal to up their child tax credit. So they already have a tax credit of about $2,000 per family for every child, or?
No, it's one of those things where you qualify for depending on your income. There's
Gotcha.
sort of staggering rates. So up to $2,000 per child. That benefits more than 40 million families in America at the moment. This was one of those policies actually that came up in your chat with Ben Smith. He talked about it being one of the things that Harris is really campaigning on.
Yes.
What she wants to do is to give low and middle income families up to $6,000. So that's her change.
Yeah, to help with their expenses. However, that boost in that payment is actually going to happen whether Harris or Trump gets elected. JD Vance said they'd like to raise it to $5,000 and open it up to all Americans, including high income earners. And I guess this is the point of difference a little bit.
It is, yeah, and it's one that's going to continue to come up as we head towards election day. As for Trump, he's also talking about high costs of living, and the answer for him is to bring more jobs to America. This is a
Not a
very
surprise.
familiar theme. So manufacturing jobs in particular, they shouldn't be going offshore from the United States. China shouldn't be taking all of those jobs from Americans. So he wants to do more to bring those manufacturing jobs back to the US. Also wants to forge ahead with mining and fracking projects for oil.
That's to reduce the reliance on imported energy sources. He also wants to put 10 to 20% tariffs on heaps of imports to encourage people to buy locally made goods. America first. I'm hearing it.
And
I'm hearing it.
And by the way, that's the technical term, heaps of imports.
Oh, he said that.
I think we should just assume
Heaps
that
and
that's
heaps
the
of
case.
imports.
Yeah.
That's problematic because for decades there's been a move towards globalisation, of course, free trade. But the trade-off when any manufacturing moves offshore is the loss of local jobs.
Yeah, and this is what Trump is on about. It's what he's always been on about. This is very, very much home base for him. So he's promised to bring a lot of those jobs back. Also been hammering that message in the Midwestern Rust Belt. So we're talking about states like Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania. They're places that have lost a lot of jobs due to that issue.
Talked about the blue wall last week, and again, another reason to listen to that very first US election shortcut. The blue wall is the states that may really matter in this election. These sorts of policies are where the rubber hits the road in those places.
Yep, America first. It's a really strong point for Donald Trump.
For their part, the Democrats also want to do their bit to support the homegrown industry. Their focus is much more on green energy projects. It's a bit similar to our government's Future Made in Australia policy. That gives tax breaks to companies investing in green energy projects and computer chip technologies.
It's absolutely an effort, as you mentioned, the Australian government policy as well, to try and get away from those old type of jobs and into the new economy. So where are the things that the world are going to need in great numbers? Computer chips are absolutely one of those things. And also tackling this issue of getting down to net zero emissions. So those green energy projects as well. That's absolutely where the Democrats are focusing on.
Tax cuts also. Economists reckon neither of them have done the maths properly on affording all the tax cuts that they're promising. Both parties are promising tax cuts. Reports say Harris's tax relief package will add $3.5 trillion to the national debt. It'd blow out by $7.5 trillion under Donald Trump.
At the moment, when you look at the two campaigns, tax cut just rolls off the tongue. Mm-hmm. So you can see why the experts are a little bit worried about that. It is very much in the populist kind of stream of Donald Trump's announcing a big tax cut almost every week at the moment. The Harris campaign is doing something similar. Where those numbers land and how they're actually going to pay for all that kind of stuff are big questions for either of the winning sides to work that out if they're successful.
So that's kind of the lay of the land when it comes to the candidates' economic policies. Next, we'll look at Trump and Harris's approach to other top-of-mind issues: abortion, gun control, and climate change. Returning to that research, that Pew research we mentioned earlier, access to affordable healthcare is the number 2 issue for voters according to that survey. Trump remains committed, Claire, to dismantling the Obama-era reforms to give more Americans health insurance coverage. Oh, the American healthcare system is blows my mind.
Yeah.
Harris says she'll put more money into those systems, but when it comes to health policy in this election, it's actually about abortion rights.
Yeah, so abortion rights considered a top 10 issue just in and of its own right. This has been an issue that the Democrats have really campaigned very heavily on for more than 2 years. That was after the Supreme Court's decision to overturn that landmark ruling that was Roe versus Wade.
Roe v. Wade, just a reminder, that case from 1973 set the precedent to protect the rights of women at a federal level if they wanted to terminate an unwanted pregnancy. When it was overturned, all of that changed. The laws around abortion were left up to each individual state.
And some states have moved very, very quickly to pass new laws banning abortions. Those were mainly Republican-led states, particularly in the more conservative South. So as of today, every state in the South, except for Virginia, has banned abortions, including in cases of rape and incest.
Yeah, you can see how this is a huge issue. Harris wants to enshrine women's rights to have an abortion in the Constitution so that it's guaranteed going forward. A difficult thing to do, but that's what she said she'd like to do. She says along with ensuring the health of women, it's about protecting personal freedoms. She's repeatedly said, and this is the quote, "The government shouldn't be telling people what to do with their bodies." As we've mentioned, we've actually talked about this a little bit on Weekly Wrap, our other podcast over on the News Club feed a couple of times, Claire. Donald Trump's position on abortion has been harder to pin down this time around.
Yeah, so you might assume that he would be out saying banning abortion's a really great thing. That's, I think, what many people would assume his position would be. But he's ruled out a national abortion ban heaps of times in this campaign. That's something that comes up regularly. He says that it's appropriate for the individual states to do their thing, whatever they think is appropriate for their jurisdictions. It's a real dance that he's doing because he's responsible for appointing 3 judges to the Supreme Court. He did that when he was president between 2016 and 2020. They have been pivotal to that decision to overturn Roe v. Wade.
Yeah, his wife Melania has also weighed in defending women's rights to abortion in her memoir that was released just a couple of weeks ago. And the thing to know here, I guess, is, as we talked about last time, the 7 swing states are key to who will win this election. So where are they on abortion?
Yep. This is where zeroing in on those swing states is really helpful. So on abortion, all eyes are on Arizona. It's one of those swing states. It's banned abortion after 15 weeks of pregnancy. There are just to do the maths on it, there are 3.3 million voters in that state in 2020. There'll be a handful more this time around, probably. Biden won its 11 electoral college votes by just about 10,000 votes.
So really close.
It was the closest race. One poll says that 16% of Arizona voters have put abortion as their number one issue. That's a lot of votes when it comes down to a race that's tight. So there's plenty of those people who are angry about the removal of abortion as a right for women in that state. It's potentially consequential for Trump there.
And this explains why there's lots of commentators saying that he is deliberately not taking a very clear position on this. He's not going hard on being anti-abortion this time around. He does think it could influence whether or not he wins the election. Moving on to another top 10 issue, it's gun control. There's been 2 assassination attempts on Trump during this campaign. This hasn't given him any pause for thought or change to his approach to gun laws, though.
It really hasn't. No, he continues to staunchly defend Americans' rights to bear arms. He's against any change to the gun laws. That includes raising the legal age to buy a weapon. These are sort of 3 things that are on any reformist agenda. Raising the legal age, more thorough background checks, and also limiting sales of assault rifles. Trump is not for any of those.
Is that the policy of the Harris campaign, any of those?
She certainly wants to make sure that the legal age is raised, and she's also talked about those assault rifle bans.
Basically, to summarise, she's vowed to tighten the laws around gun ownership. She supports, as you say, a federal assault weapons ban and universal background checks. She has said, though, that her running mate Tim Walz owns guns, and she also owns a gun. This is where I just go, America and the gun debate, it's so hard to understand.
It's so hard to understand.
It's very hard to be Australian and understand it.
Yeah. So just in the last week, she's talked about owning a Glock, which is a handgun. Owning a handgun like that in California is very, very tricky. So she's had to answer all sorts of questions about how she was able to do that. It's a whole thing.
And why. Connected to this issue is the issue of violent crime, of course, a top 5 issue for voters.
Yep. So part of Trump's platform is fighting crime gangs, also the drug cartels. He's linked all of that to the country's immigration issues. He says that it's people who have come into America illegally across the border, particularly the border with Mexico. Many of them are murderers and rapists. He says that that's down to the policies of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris.
For her part, Harris has used every chance she's had to remind people that she was the top law enforcement officer in the biggest state in the country. It's true, she was the Attorney General in California. She also reminds people, Claire, often that Donald Trump is convicted of a crime.
He's a convicted felon. She does weave that into her campaign speeches quite a lot.
Let's finish up with climate change policy. It's a top 10 issue overall. Barely rates for Republican supporters, though. 60% of Democrats say it's something that will inform their vote. We've talked about Harris's focus on funding for renewable energy projects.
Yep, tax credits, as we said, tax credits and tax cuts seem to be the answer to a lot of people's problems in this campaign. Also rebates for electric vehicle owners. She says that she's not going to ban fracking. This has been a real issue in this campaign. That's really upset some environmental groups. They were hoping that she would revert to her former position against fracking. It comes up a lot because when she ran against Biden for the presidential spot 4 years ago, she was anti-fracking. When she joined Team Biden as the vice president, she reversed that position.
Remind her on what fracking is, because I feel like it's okay if you don't know.
Basically, you get gas and oil from the ground by sort of going in. It's high pressure drilling. Yeah, it's a whole thing. There's lots of questions about earth tremors, what it does to the water table, what it does to the environment more broadly, the pollution, also the emissions that it releases. So yeah, it's highly controversial.
I just feel like people talk about fracking like everyone should know exactly what it is, but it's okay if you don't. This shortcut isn't about fracking, though. We'll get into that another time. This fracking issue, though, does come down to the swing states. This is a particularly key issue for voters in Pennsylvania, where the fracking industry has driven industrial and economic growth in the state. How many electoral college votes do they have?
19. Yeah. So it's a state that you do really want to win.
You want to win that one. For Trump, his policy position is summed up with the slogan, and we alluded to this earlier, drill, baby, drill. That is the quote. When he was in office, he rolled back hundreds of environmental protections. He withdrew the US from the Paris Agreement. They rejoined that under Biden in 2021, but Trump has said that he'd pull out again if he was re-elected. He wants to make America the world's leading producer of oil and gas.
Yeah. And also has plans to lift restrictions on energy production and expand Arctic drilling.
Drill, baby, drill. That wraps up part 2 of our shortcut series on the US election. Next time, I think this is the one I'm probably most keen for, Claire, is the approach from each side on international issues in this election. So things like where the candidates sit on foreign policy, immigration, and the wars in the Middle East and Ukraine. On to our recommendations. Each week we like to give you a recommendation for some further reading, watching or listening. I think we should just put a link to that Pew Research. If you really want to get into it all, it's there.
Lots of numbers. If you like surveys, it's a really good detailed one. They do amazing stuff, the Pew Research Centre. So even if you haven't come across it, just get onto their website and have a look at the stuff that they do. We look at it quite a bit here. The other one I've got that just might be helpful, given abortion will absolutely be a front and centre issue. There's a bit of a map about where the states have made changes in the last couple of years since that Roe versus Wade decision was overturned. It'll give you, again, a bit of a sense about the overlay when it comes to this election.
Yeah, and the implications of overturning that and why it is such a big deal. As I said, those links will be in your episode notes. Thank you for listening. Of course, if you're enjoying this series, please share it with your mates and anyone who just wants a backstory to the big news stories and wants to understand the US election. As I said, we'll be back next Thursday with another US election special shortcut. Until next time.